Hello and welcome back to part 2 of SARE Swine Biosecurity webinar. I'm Carol Delaney and I am the livestock specialist for the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry.
And I am Carolyn Hurwitz, Assistant State Veterinarian, also for the Maine Departments of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry. We are both presenting today on behalf of Colt Knight. He helped develop these materials with us for both the first and second parts of our webinar. And this is the recorded version without an audience.
Great, so let's get started. In our first part, in part 1, the presenters covered what's the definition of biosecurity and went over the methods of how diseases are spread and introduced on your farm. And knowing those methods of transmission gave ideas on what you could do to prevent the transmission of it. And in this part, we're going to go over sanitation, in continuation of what you can do to help prevent the spread of disease. And farm protocols, quarantine, and we'll also go over, Carolyn will go over specific diseases and then the implications of what you would do to prevent them. Okay, so we'll start with biosecurity and sanitation. So in sanitation, what we want to emphasize is it's a kind of a multi-step process. And so first, if you've had animals in a place, and maybe it's after quarantine, you want to clean out all organic material. And organic material is anything kind of with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which is manure, bedding, plant materials, even animal materials like placenta, things like that. So clean all that out. That's the dry part. The wet part is wash it down with soap and water. So you want to get rid of organic matter from the surfaces, that have dried on, because this will deactivate most disinfectants. You've got to get rid of that. And then once you wash it off, just kind of like you're doing dishes, you got to rinse it. So rinse that. And then you'll choose your disinfectant. So you've got to look at the labels. There's a certain contact time, concentration, storage, what temperature it should be stored at, and they all have expiration dates. Some of them have precautions in terms of breathing things in. So you want to make sure you have maybe you'll have a respirator, have good ventilation, and also wear gloves depending on the product. You should consider the temperature that you're mixing it in. Some of them have specific things, like some maybe won't dissolve well if it's not a certain temperature. Hardness of water. If you have hard water, that's going to affect some disinfectants, and so you might have to choose a different one that isn't affected. And then the type of surface that you're washing, if it's porous, it's not, these disinfectants will not work well. One thing, I'll give you an example. So I bring the livestock scale around to weigh mostly cattle this past year anyway, and I want to bring it clean to the next farm. So I'll show up, and after we've weighed cattle, I will find a place that's acceptable for the farm, and I will wash it off with a hose. And so I'll remove it's the best way, move all the manure and urine that's in there. And then I'll take a bucket and put detergent in it and scrub it down with a brush, and then I'll rinse it again. And then I choose bleach, and at a certain concentration, I'll mix it up with water and I'll spray it on, and then I leave it. So that's an example of what I do for disinfecting. Okay, next slide. All right, so we're just going to splash a few disinfectants in front of you. There's much more information in our packet that we sent, but just so you're familiar, bleach is one choice, and that's a sodium hypochlorite is what it is. Clorox is a name brand, and most of these, including bleach, denature proteins. A lot of your infective agents are proteins or amino acids. So it's cheap, it's very corrosive in its original form. When you dilute it, it's not as bad. It's very basic in nature. There's not acidic, it's actually basic, and that it can be corrosive too. If you mix it with ammonia, it can be a toxic gas. So you want to be careful and read those instructions, and that's why they talked about ventilation also. It's pretty cheap, so and it actually covers just about everything in terms of killing it. But again, you have to clean it, not have organic matter. It will be deactivated by that. Iodine compounds are another example. Povidone is something, it's actually more of a medical product, but it works like bleach. It's almost as good in terms of what it covers. It doesn't kill spores, for example, from like fungus and things. And it does stain. So that's some people, it's very common, it's affordable. Dairies often have it, but that's probably a negative with that, it stains. Another type of disinfectant are detergents, and they're usually quaternary ammonium compounds. You probably will see these on some of your own laundry detergents. And what they do is not only denature proteins like the bacteria, they bind to the phospholipids in the membrane of the bacteria. So it's like when you wash something, the compound will bind to the grease, take and put it in solution. So that's what it's doing. It's also attacking membranes that have lipid material in them. And it is definitely inactivated by organic matter. So it's a little easier to work with, but maybe not as effective. And then the first three are probably pretty affordable. I mean, they're all affordable, but Virkon and Novosan, this is the fourth category we're just throwing out there, is probably more expensive. And these are peroxygen. They're like hydrogen peroxide type compounds. They also denature proteins and lipids, and they are effective with organic matter, actually. We're more effective. So you kind of have your choices. But again, from the previous slide, you want to make sure you follow all the directions on those containers. Okay. Next slide. Thank you. So this is just a summary from, say, part 1 and part 2. I would just sit back and listen to me read it, and I don't think it'll be new, but they're important enough to go over again. So especially in the first part, we talked about quarantine. Any new arrivals and those animals returning to the farm. It's just understood you're going to quarantine those animals, and you'll talk to your veterinarian about how long to do that. Don't share equipment with other, I jumped to the next one, sorry. Use separate equipment for your healthy and sick animals. Put your sick animals in a quarantine area and take care of them last. Keep separate boots and, for those animals and things like, and your covering. Don't borrow tools or equipment from other farms. If you do, you want to wash, just what we went over. Clean often, say in between groups, to decrease the pathogen load in the environment. And then, watch for signs of infectious diseases, especially during quarantine. And then talk to your veterinarian on what things you might want to be alerted about, and get familiar with those so you know what are the symptoms. And following that, discuss these inoculations to vaccinate your animals against the certain pathogens. So your farm might be different than a farm in the next county and what you do. When you do find a sick animal, record it, write down, measure some things about it, and report it to your veterinarian and anyone else who's working with the animals.
Thanks, Carol. So for part 2, Carol so far covered sanitation and farm protocols. And those farm protocols should be followed by everybody that's involved in the farm management. So for this last portion of part 2, I'm going to cover quarantine, and then we'll do a couple disease examples. So before we start talking about the quarantine, I first want to cover this concept of a carrier pig, because the carrier pig is really the reason why we recommend quarantine as an effective biosecurity tool to help you break the transmission cycle. So a carrier pig is an individual animal who carries an infectious organism without expressing disease. Sometimes they can outwardly appear sick, but a carrier pig can also be harboring this pathogen and not necessarily appear sick to you. An example of this could be Mycoplasma pneumoniae. Sometimes a pig could look outwardly perfectly happy and healthy, but they've recovered from mycoplasma and then are carrying that in their upper airway, and that's the way that they could introduce it to your herd. So these carrier pigs are the #1 route of disease introduction to a herd. And this can really happen by any of the transmission methods that we talked about in part 1. So that could be direct contact, aerosol transmission, oral exposure, or fomite or vector transmission. So it's pretty equal opportunity risk. But the good news is there are steps that you can take to combat this risk. So we're going to focus for the next couple of slides on quarantine. But in addition, things like targeted disease surveillance testing when you have these suspect carrier pigs, knowing the herd history from where that carrier pig came from, and certainly applying vaccinations to that pig and then to the rest of the herd that's going to be welcoming in this potential carrier pig. So focusing first on quarantine, the reason we do this is isolation. The goal of the quarantine period is to isolate a pig or perhaps a group of similar status pigs in order to prevent pathogens moving from that new pig to other susceptible pigs. So I've selected this picture here on the left of some pretty sorry looking pigs. So this is a group of similar status pigs. They are new to a farm and they need to be isolated. So these carrier pigs are showing you that they're sick, but they don't always give it away this easily. So a quarantine period is really recommended when you're combining 2 groups or introducing 1 pig to a group so that you can avoid any potential negative impact of a carrier pig. So you want to do this during high risk periods. And high risk period is a point in time when that carrier pig or a sick pig or a pig that's been exposed to disease is most likely to develop and show clinical signs of disease. So this could occur upon introduction to a herd. Perhaps if you have a pig of yours that's gone out to a fair or other exhibit and are returning to your herd, or when you notice a sick pig. And Carol mentioned this when she reviewed the farm protocols with us. How long to quarantine for really depends on the disease that you're particularly concerned about. So unfortunately, this is one of those tricky answers where there really is no one correct answer, but there are some helpful guidelines to use to help determine what quarantine period is going to be most effective for you in your situation. So 2 things to consider are the incubation period of the disease or diseases you may be concerned about, and then also this carrier status like we talked about just a slide ago. So the incubation period, we'll define that. That is the period of time between exposure to infectious disease and then subsequently developing clinical signs of that disease or the ability to spread that disease. So if a disease has a long incubation period, then that's going to necessitate that you follow a longer quarantine period. And then the reverse is true. For a short incubation period, that animal's going to show you sooner that it might be sick. So you'll be able to act on that sooner. So that means a shorter quarantine period. And it's the same math with the carrier state. So a long carrier state means a long quarantine. A short carrier state means a short quarantine. So we'll put that into some more concrete context. If we use swine influenza as our example, if we're wanting to quarantine pigs because we think they might have come from a herd with a swine influenza outbreak, and we want to make sure when we introduce that pig to our herd, we don't spread that disease. The 2 things to know about swine influenza relative to our quarantine math, it's got a short incubation period, meaning a pig that's exposed to swine influenza is probably going to start to look sick within a week if it's been infected. And there really isn't a carrier state for swine influenza. So once a pig heals from that disease, they're not going to continue to carry that virus. So because incubation period and carrier state are both short for swine influenza, then we can follow a shorter quarantine period. So the standard 30-day quarantine for that disease is likely to be effective. So what constitutes a true quarantine? If you're going to go through all of this effort, it's important to pay attention to the details and make sure you do it correctly. So during a quarantine period, you need to make sure that you can achieve physical separation from the rest of the pig herd and also from other livestock on your farm and from wildlife. In part one, we talked about vector species. So it's important that any sick pig or a suspect pig is not shedding any pathogens into the environment that are then carried around by wildlife or other livestock. So that physical separation is really important. Aerosol separation is also an important thing to focus on when you are making your plans for quarantine. It's not necessarily critical to have the animals separated by miles or physical structures. That's not always possible with the infrastructure that we have here in New England. But if you have two pigs in stalls that are next to each other, even if the wall, the half wall between them is solid, there's still quite the possibility of shared airspace in those two groups. So I would say that does not constitute a true quarantine. However, if you had a barn that was not densely stocked and had really good ventilation, you could possibly achieve good aerosol separation if they were on other sides of the barn. The best case scenario would be to have maybe one group of pigs remote from the other if they're going to be outside, or have one group inside, one group outside, keeping in mind that the quarantine is a temporary living facility. A really important concept of quarantine is all-in, all-out management. So that means you manage different groups separately. If you had a quarantine group and you were continually adding new pigs to it, then you're essentially starting the clock over every single time you add a new pig. So it's important to quarantine a group, keep them all together, follow the quarantine period, and then move them on all together. And once those animals are out, just like Carol walked us through, you would want to disinfect that environment. So some environments, like Carol mentioned, are going to be easier than others to disinfect. An environment with a dirt floor or wooden walls is going to be pretty challenging to disinfect. In that case, using heat, UV, and time are going to be your friends after you've, of course, removed as much organic material as possible. All right, so some specific tips for a successful quarantine are to, first of all, keep written records, especially if you're not working by yourself. It's really important to know when the pigs arrived, when you're expecting them to finish their quarantine, what things you want to be looking for, and then certainly if any clinical signs of disease are noted during that time, you want to write that down so that you can increase communication among your staff and, if needed, with your veterinarian. So some signs of disease you may be monitoring for are things like cough, diarrhea, loss of appetite, development of any skin lesions, lameness, or fever. During the quarantine period, you really want to minimize contact between the quarantined pigs and with other people on the farm. So having multiple staff work in the quarantine area is a bit of a challenge. Ideally, you would assign one person to work with the quarantined group. If that's not possible, you definitely want to visit the quarantine group last and take care of them last. Throughout the quarantine period, you need to focus on separation. So that's obviously physical separation of those pigs from the rest of your pigs, but also keep separate equipment. So having a set of clothes, tools, animal management equipment like feeders that is dedicated to the quarantine area is going to help you maintain that separation. You need to make sure that you maintain hygiene or sanitation of the people working with those pigs. So it's important to wash your hands on the way in and again on the way out. And then to have a plan. Certainly a plan for how you may be able to handle the pigs that are in the isolation facility. For example, if you want to vaccinate them before introducing them to the main herd, or if they do become sick during quarantine and they need to be examined, or you need to collect samples to perform some targeted disease surveillance testing, you need to have a plan in mind of how you're going to get that done in this temporary living area. The other thing to potentially plan for is a response if you decide that you don't actually want to introduce this pig to the herd. Perhaps you've learned something about that pig's health status while it's in quarantine and you don't want it anymore. It's a good idea to know what your response would be in that instance. Some common mistakes with the quarantine are following too short of a quarantine period. In the surveys that we received back from our participants, there was a couple of different responses for the quarantine time that is typically followed on each farm, and it ranged from only 7 days to 30 days was very common. Some farms identified 60 days as their quarantine period. So really across the board, and it will depend on what disease you're specifically concerned about, but 7 days is really going to be much too short of a quarantine period. Some other common mistakes are allowing pigs back into the herd without a quarantine. And this is understandable because it's a pig that you're familiar with, it's a pig that came from the herd, but it's really important to know that once that pig leaves the herd, there are exposures that are specific to that pig. And so if it then comes back into the herd, it could have been exposed to disease during its time away and is then bringing that back. So even though it's a known animal to you, it still has to go through the same quarantine period. Fomites, again, those are inanimate objects that can become contaminated with a pathogen. So fomites could be things like your boots, your coveralls, or even something like the tractor buckets. It's certainly easy to have duplicate boots, but maybe not a duplicate tractor. So it's really important to keep in mind that moving between these groups with equipment like that can be another source of contamination. So that tractor could become a fomite. Luckily, Carol's taught us some important details about the steps of sanitation that would help you to break that transmission connection between your quarantined group and your healthy herd via the tractor. So a good sanitation of that is going to help prevent that mistake during quarantine. Kind of along those same lines in terms of accidentally forming a connection between the quarantined group and the herd, you want to make sure that you manage quarantine animals last. If you can't dedicate a specific employee to the quarantine animals only, then see them last, feed them last, and then follow the sanitation steps to clean your hands and then keep your specific isolation equipment separate. And then incomplete separation really summarizes the potential to transmit disease by all these routes in terms of your clothes or other larger fomites between the quarantined group and your herd. So from the biosecurity survey, one of the responses that was shared with us is that our participants identified a couple common areas that they saw as barriers to regular biosecurity practice. So the top three reported were expense, time consuming, and not necessarily knowing which recommendations are best for the individual farm. So for that last topic, we hope to really tackle this head on at each farm through the individual biosecurity assessments. But for the top two, the expense and the time that has to be dedicated to biosecurity practice, that made us think of this question to follow up for our respondents, which I'll read here. And if you're following along as part of the SARE study, we'll ask you to answer this question in your electronic report form. But for now, we'll go through this and we can report about what we found from the group the first time through. So we asked, which item is most expensive? Disposable gloves, an extra pair of boots for farm use only, a rubber dishpan, bleach, a scrub brush, the time spent using all the things above that you already bought, or paying for respiratory diagnostics, in-feed medication, mortality losses, market losses, environmental mitigation, mortality disposal, and replacement stock. And obviously, our participants all highlighted G as the most expensive item. And we put this question here not to be patronizing, but to start the conversation that acknowledges that biosecurity management certainly does require an outlay of money and time, but it's really critical to compare those costs to the true cost of a disease response. So this question aims to really highlight what the true costs of a disease response are. And biosecurity practice can really, in the end, help save you money by avoiding most of all of the items that are accounted for in option G here. So we've talked about sanitation, we've talked about developing farm protocols and quarantine practice. So we're going to move now into two examples of diseases, infectious diseases of swine that can be combated with the biosecurity principles that we talked about at the beginning of part 2 and then in part 1. So we'll talk about swine influenza, which is swine flu or SIV. We'll talk about porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome, which is often called PRRS. And then I'll very briefly touch on the concept of foreign animal diseases, and I'll introduce 2 foreign animal diseases of pigs. So we chose to talk about swine influenza or swine flu for this presentation because in our surveys, 21% of respondents reported that they felt informed about SIV. So we thought we'd share a little bit more information here. SIV or swine flu is an enveloped virus. So this picture over here on the left or on the right illustrates that. So there's this kind of brownish grayish layer here, and that's a fatty layer that covers or envelopes this virus. And that's important when you are choosing a disinfectant to clean the environment behind pigs that may have been exposed to influenza, or if you're cleaning up after an influenza outbreak. It's important to know that about this virus in order to help you select the correct disinfectant. So when Carol was talking about things like bleach that can interrupt this layer, that is the layer that we're talking about, this fatty outside covering. Swine influenza is typically spread pig to pig through coughing, so that would be aerosol transmission. Nasal discharge, so that encompasses both direct contact and oral transmission. And transmission through the herd tends to be pretty quick. So you'll notice most of the herd is coughing and has a fever, isn't feeling well. So we call that a high morbidity when a lot of the population is affected. So clinically, what you might see in a herd is most of the herd is coughing. They'll have clear discharge from the nose or the eyes. They'll be really pretty tired and slow, not eating well, and typically will have a high fever. Uncomplicated flu means that the pig just has this influenza virus. It's not complicated by any other infectious diseases like mycoplasma or PRRS, which we'll talk about in a minute. So in that case, uncomplicated flu is typically associated with a low death rate in the herd. So that means a low mortality. So mortality describes the number of animals that die. Morbidity describes the number of animals that are affected. So for swine influenza, we see a high morbidity and a low mortality. You can control this disease both within your herd if it's been introduced, but most effective is going to be to prevent introduction of this virus to your herd through these biosecurity practices. So a couple that we'll highlight here are, again, all in, all out management. We talked about this when we talked about some tips for success when making a quarantine plan. So again, all in, all out means that you're managing pigs in groups that all move on together through your system, rather than having a continuous population of pigs of multiple ages. This all in, all out management means that there is no opportunity for a pig to carry this virus into the group. The quarantine, which we talked about in detail, if you have new or returning pigs, a 30-day quarantine should be adequate for control of swine influenza because it has both a short incubation period and then really no carrier phase. Cleaning and disinfection of the pig environment, again, if you're concerned about swine influenza or if you know that you're cleaning up after a swine influenza outbreak, you are going to want to select a disinfectant that is likely to be effective here. So I lifted this right out of the sheet that was mailed to our SARE participants. And if you look for any one of these green plus boxes, or even better would be these orange with double plus boxes to indicate that these disinfectants would be effective here. But if we look over here, good old-fashioned bleach is likely to be effective once we have cleaned the environments, doing both a dry clean and a wet clean. Environmental control is another really important part of biosecurity for swine influenza. It's important to make sure that both sick people and wild birds are not allowed free access to the swine environment. And this is an interesting feature of pigs. Pigs are uniquely able to become infected with different types of the influenza virus. So pigs have the potential to pick up influenza viruses from both people, sick people, and wild waterfowl. Wild waterfowl are also an interesting species in that they can carry many different strains of influenza and not appear sick. So pigs are sometimes called a mixing vessel, which means that influenza viruses of these birds and of people can infect a pig, and then once inside the pigs, they can mix or recombine. This is not a super common phenomenon, but it is something that the pig is uniquely able to do, and it represents a potential risk, especially for this particular virus. And then an important thing to mention is just as pigs can pick up influenza viruses from people, there is also the potential for a swine influenza virus to infect a person. Again, that requires close contact, so it's not super frequent, but it is a very real risk to consider. And so vaccination for any people that would be working with pigs is a potential management recommendation. The next disease we'll talk about is porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome, and we picked this one for the same reason. Only 21% of respondents reported feeling informed about this virus, so we'll give you a little bit of information about that now. PRRS is a virus of pigs, so it's not going to infect people. And there are different strains of PRRS that really vary in their virulence. And virulence describes how much damage that virus is likely to cause. PRRS is spread from pig to pig through coughing and sneezing. So again, this is aerosol transmission. Direct contact with or oral exposure to any PRRS infected fluids of a pig. So that would be blood, urine, milk, semen, and manure. Contaminated fomites and vectors are also important in transporting this virus from a sick pig to susceptible pigs. So PRRS is really spread by almost all of the transmission routes that we talked about in part one. Clinically, what you'll see in your barns are really two different phases of this disease. So in young growing pigs, they might show you primarily respiratory disease. So you'll see things like fever, they won't be eating well, coughing, potentially even respiratory distress. Once they recover, you may notice that there's real disparity in growth rates. And then certainly as those pigs continue through the growth phase, you may notice a higher mortality rate than you may have expected otherwise. So it can be a bit of a continuous, insidious problem. The other thing to note about PRRS is that it can interact with other respiratory infections to cause a more severe disease. So remember when we talked about swine influenza, we said uncomplicated swine influenza typically is associated with a low mortality, so a low death rate. PRRS can complicate a swine influenza infection and increase the death rate from that virus. So it certainly doesn't make a pig better off to be infected with this PRRS virus. The other kind of clinical presentation of this virus is concerning the breeding herd. So the reproductive effects of the PRRS virus include decreased conception rates, premature farrowing, late-term abortions, and increases in stillborn piglets, weak piglets, or even mummified piglets. And the other thing you may notice is that the pre-weaning mortality in your nursery could be increased as well. The good news is that you can control the risk of PRRS for your herd, again, through biosecurity practices. PRRS is a virus that you would want to observe in extended quarantine for. because it has quite a long carrier phase, meaning once a pig has been infected and they recover from PRRS, they actually carry that in their body for quite a long time, even up to 120 days, though typically around 60 days seems to be the most common outside window. So one thing to consider when you're quarantining, if PRRS is a concern, is to plan for an extended quarantine, 60 days, even up to 120 days. But the other thing that you can do in cooperation with your veterinarian is conduct surveillance testing of the pigs in quarantine to see if they've been exposed to PRRS, or perhaps if there are any mortalities in that quarantine group, to perform some targeted testing to see if you can detect this virus. Additionally, if you purchase pigs from a herd source that is known to be PRRS negative, if they conduct routine surveillance on their herd and are maintaining a PRRS negative herd, that would be a low risk group to purchase pigs from. And then, of course, sanitation of the environment and any equipment that you may use with a group of pigs showing you respiratory disease is going to help prevent spreading PRRS within your herd if it's already been identified. So just like we did for swine influenza, this is also an enveloped virus, and we can see that our friend bleach is also likely to be effective as the disinfection step once we've done both our dry cleaning and our wet cleaning. So we'll move through this really quickly since we don't have an audience to report to us for this recording. But again, if you're participating for the SARE study, please do answer both of these questions, both for swine influenza and for PRRS, to let us know if the last couple minutes you spent listening to us has been beneficial to you and you're learning about both of these viruses. All right. I'll quickly talk about foreign animal diseases. And we're just going to introduce this topic here and not get too into any of the specifics about these two diseases. But a foreign animal disease is a serious disease or a pest of livestock and poultry in the United States. And these diseases do not currently exist here in the United States. So that's why we call them foreign animal diseases. The United States Department of Agriculture, which is the USDA, monitors for and develops response plans for foreign animal diseases. So foot and mouth disease, or FMD, and African swine fever, or ASF, are both foreign animal diseases, and these are classified as Tier 1 viruses. So this means that as Tier 1 viruses, both of these pose a severe threat to US animal health, and in some cases, the economy and human health as well. ASF and FMD have not been shown to be a significant threat to human health, but certainly to animal health and specifically to pigs. Foot and mouth disease can affect other hoof stock, but African swine fever and FMD are probably the two foreign animal diseases that are receiving the most attention right now in terms of research and funding for these prevention plans. Quick warning, I'm about to put up a couple of grosser pictures, so if this isn't your style, then turn away for a moment. But this picture here on the left in the red box, that's a pig that is showing some of the classic signs of African swine fever, so primarily death. Maybe one of the first signs or only sign that you see, but also all of those kind of purple blotches on the skin is bleeding under the skin or hemorrhages. So this is classified as a hemorrhagic disease, meaning there tends to be lots of bleeding. And then on the right, these are two pictures of a pig that is infected with the foot and mouth disease virus. You can see the sloughing of the hoof wall at the coronary band on the left. And then on the right, on the nose, you can see that's a ruptured vesicle. So those would be signs indicative of both of these foreign animal diseases. So again, we don't have these diseases here in the United States, but we're constantly conducting surveillance to try to detect them as soon as possible. The real goal is to prevent the introduction of foreign animal diseases. And we do this through education about the disease, but also education about effective biosecurity practices. And one of the most important parts of preventing introduction and spread of these diseases is consistent animal health monitoring. So if you ever see anything weird, it's important to look into that. So because of that, it was really encouraging to us to see from the survey that 55% of respondents report conducting routine necropsies on unexplained pig mortalities. And this is a really important practice because it will help you identify anything unusual that's been introduced to your herd, whether it's something as significant as a foreign animal disease or something as expected as an introduction of a more common infectious disease of swine. So this was an excellent statistic for us to collect from the survey. We really appreciate your answers. So that led us to our next question for participants, which was, which animal is most likely to yield the best information from a post-mortem exam? So again, if you are following along for the study, please go ahead and answer this question in your online form. And I'll share now that our respondents from the presentation pretty much unanimously selected C, which was great. The correct answer, if there ever is a correct answer for this question, was C, any pig or pigs from the sick group that is just starting to show the same signs you were concerned about but hasn't yet been treated. And this is a great answer because this group of animals has the potential to reveal a lot of helpful information about the causes of illness that you're seeing in your herd, especially if you're willing to sacrifice more than one pig and submit tissues for exam to the lab. And the post-mortem exam in general is an excellent opportunity for partnering with a veterinarian who can advise you about which animals to examine, what tissues to collect, and how to interpret what you're finding, both on the farm and in your lab report. And one important thing to stress is that even if a necropsy does not provide a definitive answer about what the herd's current problem is, it's still a valuable diagnostic tool because it can also provide information about what is not happening on your farm. For example, not African swine fever and not foot and mouth disease. So the necropsy is definitely an important tool, and I would argue for opening up any pig mortalities that you have as an opportunity to gain some information that will help you manage the rest of the herd. I think Carol's going to take us through the last couple of slides here. And you're muted.
All right, here I am.
Thanks,
Thank
Carol.
you. So we've completed all that we want to cover in these two parts. There's obviously a lot more to cover, but we wanted to give you some tools and information you could use. So what we'd like you to consider is, from what you've learned, is what do you think your farm's greatest transmission risks are? So at the beginning, part one, you learned about making a map. You know, where are people, where are animals, where are visitors, trucks, deliveries coming into your farm? And, so where can you structurally control these areas? And then we also gave you some, management things to do in terms of quarantine and that type of thing. And we will be doing on-site biosecurity evaluations, looking at what you're doing now and what you plan to do. And in your packet, you have a plan, a template to create your own biosecurity plan. And then there's an example one also. And we're just going to work together on it. You know, you're the one who knows best where you might be weak. And then we can also just give suggestions and feedback. And we will be in touch with you to set up a date to come and not only look at your biosecurity risks and plan, but also this is where we're going to survey for disease and take samples. And we will be following CDC recommendations and prevention protocols for COVID-19. And you will be getting, I believe that's what they'll be getting, their box of supplies for your own biosecurity plan, and then we will follow our own, what we've recommended for you. We are going to come in very clean, and everything, sampling equipment, our boots, our clothes will not have been on another farm. So, and they'll be clean. Anything you want to add, Carolyn?
No, I think that covers everything. Our plan is to work with no more than one farm per week. So if anything, it will have been longer than 7 days since our vehicle was on another pig farm. But we will be car washing inside and out, and having all new equipment and practicing effective sanitation of reusable equipment like the hog snare, which is pictured here. So I put this picture in here just to show what that piece of equipment looks like in case you're not yet familiar with it. It's usually, so this is what it looks like, but it usually involves quite a bit of vocalization from the pig. So be prepared for that, maybe with some earmuffs or earplugs. We'll certainly bring ours. But we're hoping that this is a fun, informative next phase of the project. So if there's any questions from anybody that's tuned in for this recorded version, and you would like an opportunity to connect either with Carol or myself, or with anybody else that partnered with us to deliver this information, you can use this slide here to get in touch with any one of us via email, and we would be happy to answer your questions or provide any feedback. And we appreciate that you spent your time tuning in. Thank you.
Thank you.